Brother, sister, has someone ever corrected you sharply, confidently, in the name of the Lord, and you accepted it instantly simply because they used the word correction? Maybe it happened in a small group, a family conversation, or a private message that left you turning their words over in your mind for days afterward. Most Christians have been taught that submitting to correction is always the spiritual thing to do. We've been told that pride resists correction, that humility receives it, that anyone who pushes back on a word from God is probably just defensive. So we swallow it, we absorb it, we let it reshape how we see ourselves, even when something in us quietly recoils. But here is what almost nobody teaches plainly. Not all correction comes from a place Scripture would actually recognize as legitimate. Some of it is not correction at all. It is projection, control, or harm, wearing the language of spiritual authority. And accepting it without discernment does not make you humble. It makes you vulnerable to being shaped by something that was never meant to shape you. Galatians 6:1 tells us how genuine correction is supposed to work. Brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently. Notice the word gently. Notice that it assumes relationship, spiritual maturity, and care, not just confidence or volume. Correction was never meant to be a weapon. It was meant to restore. So today, we are going to name 3 specific kinds of people whose correction you should never simply accept at face value, no matter how confident, how spiritual, or how convinced of their own rightness they seem to be. This is not about becoming someone who can never be corrected. It is about discernment, recognizing the difference between correction that restores and correction that wounds, controls, or distorts. By the end of this video, you will know exactly how to tell which kind of correction you are actually receiving and what to do when it is not the kind Scripture describes. Stay with me. This one matters. The first kind of person is this: the one correcting you out of their own unhealed pain. This is the person whose correction sounds spiritual, but actually traces back to something unresolved in them, a past wound, an insecurity, an old resentment dressed up as discernment about you. They may genuinely believe they are speaking truth, but what is actually happening is projection. They are reacting to their own pain through the lens of your life, rather than addressing something that is truly there. Think about what this looks like practically. Someone who is deeply hurt by someone confident in the past suddenly labels your confidence as pride. Someone who struggles with their own unaddressed anger suddenly accuses your calm boundary setting as coldness or unforgiveness. Someone who never received affirmation growing up reacts harshly when you celebrate something good in your life, calling it seeking attention. None of these reactions are really about you. They are about wounds the person speaking has never brought to God for healing. This matters because Scripture is clear that we see through a limited, sometimes distorted lens until our hearts are renewed. Matthew 7:3-5 gives us Jesus' own warning about this exact pattern. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? Jesus is not saying correction is always wrong. He is saying that someone operating from their own unaddressed plank will consistently misjudge the speck in someone else, because their vision itself is distorted by what they have not dealt with. This is why correction from an unhealed source so often feels confusing rather than clarifying. It does not quite fit. It labels something healthy as harmful, or something neutral as sinful, because the person speaking is interpreting you through their own unresolved pain rather than through genuine discernment. If a correction leaves you more confused about who you are than clear about something you actually need to change, that confusion itself is worth examining, not explained away as a sign you need to humble yourself further. The second kind of person is this: the one who has no relational right or closeness to speak into your life. Correction is not meant to come from anyone with an opinion and enough confidence to voice it. Scripture's model assumes relationship, someone who actually knows you, has walked with you, and has earned the trust required to speak into something this personal. Galatians 6:1 does not just say, restore gently. It says, you who live by the Spirit should restore, implying a posture of spiritual maturity and genuine relational investment, not distant judgment from someone who barely knows your life. Think about how strange this would sound in any other context. A stranger who has never met your family telling you exactly how to parent your children. An acquaintance who has spoken to you twice, declaring confidently what is wrong with your marriage. Someone who follows you online, who has never had a real conversation with you, sending a message about a sin pattern they are discerning in your life. We would recognize the absurdity of this immediately in any other area. Yet in spiritual contexts, distance and unfamiliarity are often mistaken for objectivity, as if not knowing someone makes a word about them more credible rather than less. Proverbs 27:6 gives us the biblical contrast. Wounds from a friend can be trusted, but many kisses from an enemy. The weight of correction was never meant to come from proximity to confidence. It was meant to come from proximity to relationship. A friend who has earned trust through consistent presence, who has demonstrated care over time, carries an entirely different kind of authority than someone with no relational right to speak at all. This does not mean every correction must come from a close friend to be valid. Sometimes God uses unexpected voices, but it does mean that correction from someone with no earned access to your life, no track record of investment, no relational context for understanding your situation, deserves significant scrutiny before it is allowed to reshape how you see yourself. Distance is not discernment. Confidence is not closeness. The loudest voice in the room is rarely the one who has actually earned the right to speak into it. The third kind of person is this: the one whose correction consistently tears down rather than builds up. This is perhaps the clearest test available to us, because Scripture tells us plainly what genuine correction is supposed to produce. Hebrews 12:11 says it directly. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. Notice the language, a harvest, something that grows, that builds, that ultimately produces peace. Genuine correction may sting in the moment, but its fruit over time is restoration, not destruction. This means if correction consistently leaves you feeling smaller, ashamed, confused about your worth, or distanced from God rather than drawn closer to Him, that is not the fruit Scripture describes, regardless of how biblical the delivery sounded. 2 Timothy 3:16-17 tells us Scripture itself is useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness, so that the servant of God may be thoroughly equipped for every good work. The purpose stated here is equipping, building someone up to do good, not tearing someone down until they feel unusable. Think about the pattern over time, not just a single instance. Does this person's correction, again and again, leave you feeling closer to God and clearer about who you are in Him? Or does it leave you smaller, more anxious, more uncertain, more ashamed each time? Genuine correction, even when it is hard to hear, ultimately produces clarity and hope. Counterfeit correction produces a fog that never quite lifts. This is also why tone and aftermath matter as much as content. Someone can say technically true things in a way that crushes rather than restores. Timing, posture, and motive all shape whether correction lands as Hebrews 12:11 describes, or as something else entirely. If the same person's words consistently leave wreckage rather than growth in the lives of those they correct, that consistent pattern is itself the evidence Scripture tells us to look for. Fruit reveals the source, even when the words sound right, and even when the person delivering them insists their intentions were good. 3 kinds of people, 1 test, 1 responsibility that falls on you every time someone claims to correct you. The one correcting you out of their own unhealed pain. The one with no relational right or closeness to speak into your life. The one whose correction consistently tears down rather than builds up. None of these require you to become someone who rejects all correction, or who treats every uncomfortable word as automatically illegitimate. They simply require you to test what you receive, the same discernment Scripture commands in every other area of spiritual life. Here is what is important to remember. Rejecting bad correction is not the same thing as rejecting correction itself. Proverbs 15:31-32 tells us, "Whoever heeds life-giving correction will be at home among the wise. Those who disregard discipline despise themselves, but the one who heeds correction gains understanding." Genuine correction remains one of God's gifts to His people, a means of growth we should never close ourselves off from entirely. The goal is not to become uncorrectable. It is to become wise about which corrections are actually worth receiving, and which ones were never carrying the weight they claim to have. This also means you do not owe automatic submission to every voice that frames itself as speaking for God. You can examine the source. Are they walking in health? Addressing their own issues honestly? You can examine the relationship. Have they earned the right through presence and care, to speak this directly into your life. And you can examine the fruit. Does this correction, over time, produce the harvest of righteousness and peace? Hebrews 12:11 describes. Or does it produce shame and confusion instead? So the next time someone says, "I need to correct you about this," do not simply receive it because it is confidently delivered or sounds spiritual. Ask the honest questions. Is this coming from their healed place or their wound? Do they actually know me, and have they earned this access? And when I look at the pattern of their words over time, do I see a harvest of peace or a trail of damage? If this stirred something in you, do not scroll past it. Sit with it. And if you want more direct, biblical warnings like this one, straight to the point, no sugarcoating, subscribe to Biblical Warning now, because we are not here to make you comfortable. We are here to help you stay awake. Test every correction, receive what builds, and never let a wound disguised as wisdom reshape who you are.